April 16, 1945. A German nurse named Margaret Hoffmann stood with a cyanide pill hidden in her uniform pocket, ready to swallow it the moment Canadian soldiers came through the door. She had been told they would torture her. She had been told they would execute medical staff. She had been told that death by her own hand was better than what the enemy would do. But in the next 60 seconds, everything she believed about the war, about her country, about the enemy, was about to shatter. Because when that Canadian officer walked in, he did not raise his gun. He said 3 words that would haunt her for the rest of her life. "You're still nurses." Hey, quick moment. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next gripping episodes. Join us as we uncover more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. Be part of our community, exploring the untold chapters of history. Now let's dive into one of the most shocking psychological battles of World War II. This is the story of 27 German military nurses who spent 18 months as prisoners of war in Canada and discovered something more terrifying than any battlefield. They discovered they had been lied to about everything. Their entire worldview, carefully constructed by Nazi propaganda, collapsed not under bombs or bullets, but under the weight of 3 meals a day, clean hospital beds, and human decency. By the time they returned to Germany in 1946, they were no longer the same women. Some called them traitors. Others called them victims. But they knew the truth. Canada had defeated them more completely than any army ever could, simply by treating them like human beings. Margaret Hoffmann was 34 years old in April 1945, and she believed with absolute certainty that she would die a horrible death within hours. She stood in a field hospital near Oldenburg in northwest Germany, watching Canadian armored vehicles surround the building through the dusty windows. Inside the hospital were 147 wounded German soldiers, too injured to walk or fight. There were 31 medical workers, 27 women, and 4 elderly doctors who were too old for combat duty. Margaret was the head nurse. She had worked as a military nurse for 12 years since 1933, the same year the Nazi Party took full control of Germany. She joined because she wanted to help people, but over the years, the military medical service became something else entirely. It became part of the war machine. And Margaret believed in that machine completely. For months, as the German army collapsed across Europe, propaganda officers visited the medical units regularly. They held mandatory meetings where they repeated the same warnings over and over until the words became truth in the nurses' minds. "The Canadians will torture you," the officers said. "They have no honor. They do not follow the Geneva Convention like civilized nations. They will hurt you in ways you cannot imagine. They say they will execute all medical personnel because you helped keep German soldiers alive to fight again." The propaganda officers showed photographs, though Margaret would later realize they were probably fake. Pictures of burned villages, pictures of dead civilians. They said the Canadians did this. They said the enemy was savage and cruel. The nurses heard these warnings so many times in so many different ways that questioning them became impossible. Margaret made a decision that seemed logical at the time. She told the other nurses to hide cyanide pills in their uniform pockets. If the Canadians came, they could swallow the pills and die in minutes instead of enduring torture for hours or days. Death by choice seemed like dignity. At least that is what she told herself. Next to Margaret stood Elise Bauer, only 22 years old. Elise came from a small farm in Bavaria in southern Germany, far from the cities and the bombing and the worst of the war. She grew up milking cows and planting vegetables. She never cared about politics. She never joined the Nazi youth groups because her parents were quiet people who avoided attention. But in September 1944, when she turned 21, the government conscripted her into medical service. They gave her 3 months of basic training in Munich, teaching her how to clean wounds, change bandages, and give injections. Then they sent her to this field hospital in January 1945. She had been there less than 4 months. Elise did not understand ideology or propaganda the way Margaret did. She just wanted to help sick people and survive long enough to go home to her parents. But now she was shaking with fear, because she had heard the same warnings Margaret had. She believed today would be the last day of her life. She kept touching the pill in her pocket, making sure it was still there ready. On the other side of the room stood Anna Zimmerman, 19 years old, the youngest of the medical staff. Anna came from Berlin and had lived through the worst of the bombing. Her father died fighting on the Eastern Front in Russia in 1943. Her mother disappeared when Allied bombs destroyed their neighborhood in 1944. Anna had no idea if her mother was dead or alive. She joined the medical service to escape factory work, which was brutal and dangerous. But she received almost no training. They needed nurses desperately by late 1944, so they took anyone who could follow basic instructions. Anna learned nursing by watching other people do it, copying their movements, asking quiet questions. She did not trust the Nazi Party the way Margaret did. Her father died for nothing. Her mother was gone. The war destroyed her entire life. But she still believed the Canadians would kill her today because everyone said so. Everyone. How could everyone be wrong? The three women watched through the windows as a Canadian officer approached the hospital carrying a white flag. Margaret's hands shook as she burned papers in the small stove patient record supply lists, anything that might give the enemy information. She expected the Canadians to shoot them the moment they entered the building. She leaned close to Elise and whispered, "Be brave. It will be quick if we take the pills." Elise nodded, her face pale. Anna stood frozen, unable to move or think. The door opened. A Canadian lieutenant stepped inside. He was young, maybe 27 years old, with a clean uniform and a calm expression. He carried a rifle, but it was pointed at the floor. He looked at the wounded German soldiers lying in beds. He looked at the nurses in their blood-stained uniforms, exhausted and terrified. Then he spoke in clear, fluent German. His accent was strange but understandable. "You are still nurses," he said. "Medical personnel are protected under the Geneva Convention. You will continue to care for these patients until we arrange transport to proper facilities." Margaret stared at him. Her brain could not process the words. This had to be a trick. The propaganda officers warned about this exact scenario. They said the enemy would pretend to be kind at first, then attack when the medical staff relaxed and let their guard down. She did not answer the lieutenant. She just nodded slowly, suspiciously. The Canadian soldiers did not hurt anyone that day. They did not shoot the wounded German soldiers. They did not interrogate the nurses. They did not touch anyone inappropriately. Instead, they brought food to the hospital. Real food. White bread with actual butter, not the gray substitute Germany had been eating for years. Canned meat that had real meat inside, not sawdust and grain. Vegetables that were not rotten. Elise looked at the portions and could not believe what she was seeing. Each nurse received approximately 2,400 calories of food. For the past year, maybe longer, they had been surviving on about 1,100 calories each day. Their bodies had adapted to constant hunger. Now, suddenly, there was food everywhere. Anna secretly put bread in her pocket. She thought the Canadians were fattening them up before the execution, like farmers feeding animals before slaughter. It was the only explanation that made sense in her mind. That night, the nurses whispered to each other in the dark. "Tomorrow they will move us to a processing center," Margaret said. "That is when the torture begins. That is what the propaganda officers told us. They said the enemy always waits until you are away from witnesses." Elise asked if they should try to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The German army was collapsing everywhere. The war was clearly ending. Running would just get them shot. Anna wondered if she should take the hidden pills now before things got worse. But something stopped her. The Canadian lieutenant had called them nurses, not prisoners. He had given them food, not beatings. It made no sense. None of the three women could sleep that night. They lay in their beds, listening to wounded soldiers breathing in the dark, and thought about what would happen tomorrow. Would the Canadians keep pretending to be kind? Would they separate the nurses and interrogate them one by one? Would they put them on trucks and drive them somewhere remote to kill them where no one would see? Everything they had been taught said yes, this would happen. But the Canadian lieutenant had looked them in the eyes and called them nurses. He had followed rules. He had shown respect. And that terrified them more than anything because it contradicted everything they knew about the enemy. If the Canadians were going to kill them, why waste food? Why follow the Geneva Convention? Why treat them like human beings instead of prisoners? Margaret held her hidden cyanide pill and wondered if she would need it tomorrow. She did not know that her entire understanding of the world was about to fall apart piece by piece, meal by meal, kind word by kind word. She did not know that the cruelest thing the Canadians would do was show her the truth. The next morning, April 17th, Canadian soldiers brought breakfast to the hospital. Margaret watched them carry boxes through the door and could not understand what she was seeing. White bread, soft and fresh, still warm. Real butter, yellow and creamy, not the gray industrial fat Germany used. Cans of meat that actually contained meat, not the mystery substance they had been eating. Each nurse received a plate piled high with food. Margaret had not seen this much food on one plate since 1942, before the war turned bad for Germany. The nurses ate carefully, uncertain and suspicious, but their bodies responded to real nutrition after months of near starvation. The strangest thing was not the food. It was how the Canadian soldiers behaved. They did not yell or push. They did not grab or threaten. They called the nurses Miss and held doors open for them. When Margaret dropped a bandage, a Canadian private picked it up and handed it back to her. He smiled and said in broken German, "Here you go, miss." Elise whispered to Anna later, "They are being polite." Why are they being polite to us? For 2 days, April 17th and 18th, the Canadians allowed the nurses to continue caring for the wounded German soldiers. Nobody interrogated them about military secrets. Nobody hit them. Nobody touched them inappropriately. This confused Margaret more than anything. The propaganda officers had described the Canadians as barbaric, as animals who followed no rules and showed no mercy. But these soldiers acted like they had more rules than the German army did. They followed procedures. They maintained discipline. They showed restraint. On April 19th, the Canadians announced it was time to relocate the medical personnel to a processing facility. They loaded the 27 nurses into covered trucks. Margaret expected cattle cars like the ones Germany used to transport prisoners and other undesirables. Instead, the trucks had actual seats with cushions. The sides were canvas so the nurses could see outside and breathe fresh air. 2 guards rode with them, and both guards were women wearing Canadian Women's Army Corps uniforms. One of them offered cigarettes to the German nurses. Margaret refused immediately, certain they were poisoned or drugged. But Anna took one and smoked it nervously. Nothing happened to her. She did not collapse or become sick. As the trucks drove through the German countryside, the nurses saw things that challenged everything they believed. They passed Canadian supply depots where boxes of food, medicine, and equipment were stacked 4 meters high, an impossible amount of resources. They saw Canadian soldiers who looked healthy and strong, not thin and desperate like German soldiers. Elise estimated the Canadian soldiers weighed around 75 kilograms on average. The German soldiers they had treated weighed maybe 64 kilograms, and many weighed significantly less. The trucks were new and ran smoothly without breaking down. German army trucks constantly broke down and belched black smoke. Every single thing the nurses observed told them the same story. The Canadians had plenty of everything: food, fuel vehicles, medicine, manpower. This was not a starving, desperate enemy barely surviving like the propaganda claimed. This was a wealthy, powerful army that did not need to be cruel because it had already won. Margaret tried to rationalize what she was seeing. "This is American wealth," she told the other nurses, "not Canadian strength. The Americans give them everything because Canada is weak." But her voice sounded uncertain even to herself. Elise leaned close to Anna and whispered, "If they wanted to kill us, why waste all this food and fuel moving us around in comfortable trucks?" After 2 days on the trucks, they reached a train station. Again, Margaret expected freight cars. Again, she was completely wrong. The Canadians put them on a passenger train with actual seats, windows, and a functioning washroom. They fed the nurses 3 times every single day: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Regular meals with consistent portions. a Canadian nurse came to check on them. Her name was Captain Dorothy Mitchell. She was 29 years old and came from a place called Saskatchewan that none of the German nurses had ever heard of. Dorothy spoke reasonable German and answered questions without anger or impatience. "Where are we going?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Dorothy smiled kindly and said, "To Canada. You will be safe there as prisoners of war. The war is almost over anyway." Canada. That was across the Atlantic Ocean. Margaret's heart began pounding. They were going to drown them at sea. That must be the plan. Take them far from land where there were no witnesses, then throw them overboard where nobody would ever find the bodies. Anna asked quietly, "Will they separate us from each other?" She could not imagine being alone among enemies, isolated with no one to trust. Dorothy looked genuinely confused by the question. "No," she said. "You will stay together as a group. It is easier to manage medical personnel that way, and you can support each other." On the train journey to the coast, Margaret and the nurses made quiet observations that contradicted everything Nazi propaganda had taught them. Canadian guards who did not carry loaded weapons around prisoners. Medical personnel who treated wounded Germans the same way they treated wounded Canadians. Soldiers who laughed and played card games like regular people, not conquerors, filled with hatred. None of the three women said it out loud, but they were all thinking the same impossible thought. What if the propaganda was wrong? What if the Canadians really were not monsters? And if the propaganda lied about that? What else had been a lie? What else had they been taught that was completely false? But the doubt was dangerous. Believing the enemy could mean death. So they stayed silent and watched and waited for the truth to reveal itself. Because the truth always reveals itself eventually. The train journey ended at a port on the French coast on April 24, 1945. Margaret, Elise, and Anna stood on the dock staring at the Atlantic Ocean, a gray wall of water stretching to infinity. None of them had ever seen anything so enormous and terrifying. The HMS Letitia waited for them, a massive hospital ship painted white with red crosses on the sides. Margaret expected to be shoved into the dark cargo hold where prisoners belonged. Instead, Canadian guards led the 112 German female prisoners to actual passenger rooms. Each cabin had 8 beds with real mattresses, not wooden boards or hay sacks. The rooms had toilets that flushed and sinks with clean running water. Margaret could not understand it. Why give condemned prisoners comfortable quarters? The ship departed the next day for a 10-day journey across the Atlantic. But the question haunting all three women was simple and terrifying. What waited for them in Canada? On May 4, 1945, the ship arrived in Halifax Harbor. Margaret looked at the city and froze. There were dozens of ships organized in neat rows. Docks that functioned smoothly. Buildings that stood intact untouched by bombs. Electric lights everywhere blazing openly at night without fear. Elise whispered in shock, "Don't they worry about air raids?" Then she realized the stunning truth: no enemy planes could reach Canada. The war never touched this place. The Canadians processed them through customs with paperwork and photographs, like regular travelers, not prisoners of war. They gave each nurse an official POW card with her picture. Margaret's card read, "Prisoner of War Medical Personnel." They were assigned to Transport Unit 7, Destination Medicine Hat, Alberta. None of them had heard of it. Another passenger train waited clean and heated. As it pulled away from Halifax, Margaret looked back at the ocean. They had crossed from a destroyed continent to an untouched one. From a world where everything was broken to a place where everything worked. And she still could not understand why the Canadians had not killed them yet. May 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th. The train covered 3,500 kilometers through provinces the nurses had never heard of: Quebec, Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta. Elise pressed her face against the window, watching endless forests, then lakes so massive they looked like oceans, then cities with intact buildings and children playing in parks. She wrote in her small notebook, "May 6th passed through Montreal. No rubble piles, No burned buildings. Children playing. How? The Canadians kept feeding them 3 meals every single day. Coffee that was actually coffee, not burned grain substitute. Bread and fruit. When Anna saw an orange on her breakfast plate, she just stared. She had not seen citrus fruit since 1939, 6 years ago. She held it like gold. That night, she whispered to Elise, "How can they feed us like this if their country is starving from the war?" But looking out the window, she saw no starvation. She saw farms with fat cows and wheat fields stretching forever. On May 8th, the train stopped at Medicine Hat in southern Alberta. The POW camp sat 15 kilometers outside town. There were 550 German prisoners. Total 523 men in one section, 27 women in a separate area. The women's section had 8 wooden buildings for sleeping, a dining hall, an activities building, and a small medical office. Each building had heating and solid walls. Every woman received her own metal bed with mattress, blanket, and pillow. Bathrooms had running water and flushing toilets. The activities building shocked Elise most. Inside was a library with books in German, real books prisoners could read freely, a radio playing music, craft supplies, even a piano. Margaret stared at everything, unable to speak. In the German army, soldiers got punished for tiny mistakes. Here, prisoners got pianos. Nothing made sense. Everything contradicted what she knew about how enemies treated each other. The next morning, May 9th, the camp commander came to meet them. Major William Preston, 42 years old, from Calgary. He stood before the 27 women and said something that made Margaret's world tilt sideways again. "We have a problem," he began. "The hospital in Medicine Hat does not have enough nurses. Many Canadian nurses are overseas helping with the war effort. We desperately need medical help." He paused, looking at each woman carefully. Then he spoke the impossible words. "You are still nurses. Would you be willing to work at the hospital under supervision? The work is voluntary. Nobody has to do it. You would get paid 50 cents per day. Better food. More freedom to move around." The room went completely silent. Work at a Canadian hospital. Treating Canadian civilians. Margaret could not move or think. Her brain refused to process it. Elise raised her hand immediately and said, "Yes." Anna raised hers too, but asked suspiciously, "What is the trick? What do you really want from us?" Major Preston shook his head calmly. "No trick. We need nurses. You are nurses. You will work with Canadian supervisors. That is all." 6 days later, on May 15th, 6 German nurses started working at Medicine Hat General Hospital, a 247-bed facility. Margaret, Elise, and Anna were 3 of the 6. And this was when everything Margaret believed began to truly collapse. The head nurse was Catherine Ross, 36 years old, from a Saskatchewan farm. Tough fare, no wasted words. On the first day, she assigned each German nurse to different hospital wings. Elise went to pediatrics, Anna to surgery, Margaret to maternity. Margaret stood in the maternity ward feeling like she was losing her mind. She was helping Canadian women give birth, the enemy's children. The propaganda said Canadians were subhuman, weak, degenerate. But these mothers looked exactly like German mothers. They felt pain the same way. They loved their babies the same way. The Canadian nurses and doctors treated the German nurses like regular co-workers, not enemies. The hospital had medicine everywhere, bottles and bottles, clean bandages and sheets smelling of soap, X-ray machines that actually worked, lights powered by reliable electricity, refrigerators to keep medicine cold. Everything the German field hospitals desperately lacked. That night, Margaret wrote in her secret diary she had kept hidden since capture. May 15th, 1945. "I dressed the wounds of an enemy soldier today. He thanked me. Called me nurse, not a filthy name. What is this place?" Over the next 3 months, the nurses discovered more impossible things. The hospital cafeteria let them eat unlimited amounts. Unlimited bread, buttermilk, real meat. Anna stepped on a scale in June, and realized she had gained 8 kilograms in 1 month. Her body was remembering what it felt like to not be constantly hungry. Elise wrote a letter home to her parents in Bavaria. The Canadians read all letters before sending them, but they permitted writing. She wrote, "Mother, I eat 3 times every day. Real meat, vegetables, fruit. I am no longer hungry. I am healthy. I hope you are alive to read this." She did not know if her parents had survived. News from Germany described mass starvation under occupation. Anna noticed one supply closet at the hospital held more medicine than their entire German field hospital had possessed during the entire war. Penicillin was not rare here. They used it routinely, like it was normal. Elise helped a doctor with complicated surgery, and he trusted her to perform important tasks independently. A patient's grandmother gave Margaret a hand-knitted scarf as a thank you gift for saving her daughter during childbirth. Anna became friends with a Canadian nurse named Betty, who taught her English words patiently. But at night, back in the camp, the German prisoners argued viciously. Some still believed Nazi ideology and called those who worked traitors. Others said the war was over and they should accept reality. Margaret was torn in half. Everything she had been taught said Canada was weak, cruel, barbaric. But every single day showed her the complete opposite. Strong, kind, civilized. Anna wrote a letter she never sent to anyone. She wrote, "We were told they were monsters who would torture and kill us. They treat us better than our own army ever did. They feed us more than our own government fed us. They respect us more than our own officers respected us. Everything was a lie. Everything." The cognitive dissonance was unbearable. How could everything be wrong? How could the entire Nazi worldview be false? But the evidence was overwhelming, undeniable everywhere. Margaret started asking herself dangerous questions. If they lied about the Canadians being monsters, what else did they lie about? If they lied about Canada being weak, what else was propaganda? If they lied about the enemy, what about the Jews? What about the camps? Everyone whispered about, but nobody acknowledged. What about all the people who disappeared? The questions terrified her because once you started questioning, where did it stop? December 25th, 1945. Christmas morning arrived cold and bright in Medicine Hat. Margaret had been a prisoner for 8 months. The war ended officially on May 8th, but the nurses could not return home yet. Germany was destroyed, and there was no safe way to send them back. So they stayed in Canada and kept working. The Canadian nurses invited the German prisoners to a Christmas party at the hospital. Margaret did not want to go. She told Elise it felt wrong to celebrate with the enemy. But Elise said quietly, "They are not treating us like enemies. Why should we treat them that way?" Margaret had no answer. She agreed to go, but promised herself she would not smile or enjoy anything. She would maintain her dignity as a German. The hospital cafeteria was decorated with a Christmas tree covered in electric lights. Paper chains hanging from the ceiling. Candles on every table. A radio playing Christmas carols. The smell of pine branches mixed with cinnamon and coffee. 40 people sat together. Canadian doctors, Canadian nurses, German prisoners and patients well enough to attend. The cooks brought out turkey with stuffing, cranberries, mashed potatoes, 3 different kinds of pie, coffee, even wine. Margaret sat at the end of one table and refused to talk to anyone. She watched Elise laugh at something a Canadian nurse said. She watched Anna help carry food. She felt angry at them for forgetting which side they were supposed to be on, for betraying their country through friendliness with the enemy. But when the food came, she had to admit it smelled wonderful. She had not eaten a meal like this since before 1939, before the war started. After everyone finished eating, Catherine Ross stood holding a wine glass, waiting for silence. Then she said clearly, "I want to make a toast to our friends and family who are far away tonight. To peace. To healing." She paused and looked directly at the German nurses. "And to our German colleagues who have helped us save many lives this year. Thank you for your service." Everyone clapped. Margaret felt her face flush hot. She did not know what to do. Then a man walked to her table. Dr. James Murphy, one of the surgeons she had assisted during operations. He was 39 with gray in his hair. Margaret knew his brother had died on a French beach on D-Day fighting German soldiers. Everyone at the hospital knew this fact. Dr. Murphy held out his hand to Margaret. "Nurse Hoffman," he said formally, "I want to thank you personally for helping me in surgery these past months. You are one of the finest nurses I have ever worked with. Truly exceptional." Margaret stared at his extended hand. She could not move. Her brain stopped working. This man's brother died fighting Germans. She was German. She had believed in the Nazi cause that killed his brother. She wore the uniform of the regime that murdered his family member. And now, he was thanking her, treating her with respect, calling her one of the finest nurses. It made absolutely no sense. Nothing made sense anymore. Tears started running down Margaret's face uncontrollably. She could not stop them. 8 months of confusion, fear, and slowly crumbling beliefs came crashing down at once. She stood up quickly and ran out of the cafeteria. She heard Catherine Ross call after her, but she kept going. Outside, the cold air hit like a wall, -15 degrees Celsius. Snow covered everything in white. The sky was black and filled with stars. Everything was silent except her boots crunching in snow. Steam came from her mouth with every breath. Behind her, she could see warm yellow light from the cafeteria windows. She could hear the faint sound of Silent Night playing on the radio, first in English, then in German. The door opened and Elise came out. She walked over to Margaret and stood beside her without speaking for a minute. Then she asked gently, "Are you okay?" Margaret shook her head violently. "No, I am not okay. Everything I believed was lies. Everything we were taught was propaganda. They told us the Canadians would torture us and kill us. They told us we were superior and they were weak. They told us cruelty was strength and mercy was weakness." Her voice broke. "It was all lies, Elise. All of it. Every single thing." Elise put her arm around Margaret's shoulders. "Yes," she said quietly. "And we survived long enough to learn the truth. That is something." The door opened again and Anna came out carrying their coats. "You will freeze out here," she said, practically handing them their coats. She stood with them in the snow. After a while, she asked the question haunting all of them. "What happens when we go home to Germany?" None of them answered. They all knew what Germany looked like now, destroyed, starving, broken, occupied. And the truth they had learned here would not be welcome there. People who still believed Nazi lies would call them traitors. People who lost everything would be angry that they survived while eating well in Canada. The truth was both a gift and a curse. Inside the hospital, someone started playing the piano. The sound drifted through the walls. Silent Night again, slow and gentle. Margaret wiped her eyes and looked up at the stars. Somewhere across the ocean was what used to be her country. Here was a place that treated her better than her own government ever did. She was not the same person who got captured 8 months ago. That person believed propaganda and followed orders without question. This person standing in the snow knew what real kindness looked like, knew what genuine strength was, knew the difference between lies and truth. She would never be that old person again. And returning to Germany meant bringing this truth back to a country built on lies. January 1946. 3 weeks after the Christmas party, Margaret stopped defending the Nazi Party in the barracks. For months, some German prisoners still argued that Germany was right and the Allies were wrong. They said the propaganda was true and Canada was just pretending to be kind. Margaret used to agree with them, or at least stay silent. But now when they talked, she said clearly, "No, we were lied to. I was lied to, and I will not lie to myself anymore." This made some prisoners furious. A woman named Frau Kessler called her a traitor. Frau Kessler's husband had been a Wehrmacht officer. She refused to work at the hospital or anywhere else. She kept military discipline in her part of the barracks and saluted a picture of Hitler she kept hidden under her mattress. She told Margaret angrily, "You shame Germany by working for the enemy." Margaret looked her directly in the eyes and said, "I shame Germany by denying the truth." The truth was spreading among the prisoners whether they wanted it or not. And back in Germany, that truth would be dangerous. After that confrontation, the prisoners split into 3 distinct groups. About 30 out of 112 women stayed loyal to Nazi ideology no matter what they saw or experienced. About 60 women just wanted to survive and go home without thinking too deeply about politics or morality. About 22 women, including Margaret, Elise, and Anna, openly acknowledged that everything they had been taught was wrong. The 3 groups stopped talking to each other at meals. They sat at different tables. They avoided eye contact. The camp became divided between those who clung to lies and those who accepted truth. Margaret threw herself into learning English with obsessive intensity. By April 1946, she could speak it well enough to have real conversations. She asked Catherine Ross questions constantly. How did Canadians resist propaganda during the war? Catherine answered thoughtfully. We had education. We had newspapers that could print different opinions. We could question our leaders without being arrested or disappeared. Your government took all of that away from you systematically. Margaret understood then freedom was not weakness like the Nazis claimed. It was the foundation that made people strong enough to see truth clearly. Elise became a bridge between the different prisoner groups. She taught English classes to anyone who wanted to learn, even the ones who still believed Nazi lies. She said everyone would need English for jobs after the war ended. She started writing letters to a Canadian family she met at the hospital. They invited her to their farm for Sunday dinner twice. She ate roast chicken and vegetables and played with their children. She began planning a real future beyond survival. She wanted to study nursing properly, not just the basic training she received during the war. She wanted to become a teacher for other nurses someday. In March, Elise wrote a letter home to Bavaria. The censors read it before sending, but they let most content through. She wrote, "Dear Papa, Germany will need nurses to rebuild after the war. I am learning everything I can here so I can help when I return. The people here are kind. I eat well, and I am healthy. I think often about what we believed during the war versus what was actually true. Please save this letter somewhere safe. We will need to remember these lessons." Anna changed the most dramatically, but she was also the most angry. She was angry at the Nazi government for lying to her entire generation. She was angry at herself for believing the lies so completely. She was angry that her father died for nothing, and her mother was probably dead too. She was angry that she was eating 3 meals daily, while Germans back home were starving under occupation. One night she told Elise desperately, "Why do I get to be well-fed and safe when everyone I love is dead or suffering?" Elise did not have a good answer. She just held Anna's hand and let her cry. But Anna found purpose in her anger. She worked harder than anyone else at the hospital. She volunteered for extra shifts constantly. She learned English faster than the others through sheer determination. She said fiercely, "I could not save Germany, but I can save lives here. That has to mean something. It has to count for something." In April 1946, Anna wrote a letter she never sent to anyone. She wrote, "To whoever finds this, I was 19 when I was captured. I believed everything they told me without question. Now I am 20, and I believe nothing except what I see with my own eyes. I see that kindness is stronger than cruelty. I see that truth matters more than loyalty to lies. I see that Germany destroyed itself by believing propaganda. I will never make that mistake again." Catherine Ross wrote in her personal diary about the German nurses. She wrote, "The women who arrived last May are not the same women who will leave eventually. Some became harder and more bitter. But others, especially Margaret, have truly transformed. She questions everything now. She learns everything. She will be a remarkable nurse when she goes home. I hope Germany deserves her." Dr. Murphy thought about it differently. He wrote in a letter to his sister, "I lost my brother to German bullets at Juno Beach. I should not be able to forgive. But working next to Nurse Hoffman, I understand she was as much a victim as anyone. Propaganda poisoned an entire generation, and we are breaking that poison with simple kindness. It seems too easy, but it works." By summer 1946, the camp had only 27 female prisoners remaining. The others had been sent home or transferred to other camps. 12 women worked at the hospital. 8 worked on farms near Medicine Hat. 7 refused to work anywhere, still clinging to Nazi ideology and military pride. All of them would return to Germany before the year ended. None of them knew what they would find when they got there. Margaret wrote in her diary, "Strength comes from admitting when you were wrong, not from defending lies forever." Elise wrote to her Canadian friends, "Compassion is not weakness. It is the only thing that can rebuild what war destroys." Anna wrote in her unsent letters, "I survived, not because I was strong, but because someone chose mercy instead of revenge." September 1946. Official papers came to the camp. All German prisoners would return home by December 31st. The Medicine Hat group would leave on October 15th. Some women felt relief. Others felt fear. All of them heard the news from Germany through letters and newspapers. People were starving in the ruins. Cities were piles of rubble. Allied armies occupied everything. War crime trials were starting in Nuremberg. High-ranking Nazis were being hanged. Margaret looked at the paper and said quietly, "We are going from abundance to hell." On October 10th, the German nurses worked their last shift at Medicine Hat General Hospital. The Canadian staff threw a goodbye party in the cafeteria. Catherine Ross gave each German nurse gifts, medical textbooks in English and German, bandages, and supplies they could take home, small personal items, like photos and letters. Catherine put her hand on Margaret's shoulder and said sincerely, "You are one of the best nurses I ever trained. Germany is lucky to have you back." Dr. Murphy gave Elise an official letter. It stated she was an excellent nurse and recommended her for any nursing school. He signed it and stamped it with the hospital seal. Elise held the letter like it was made of glass, like it was the most valuable thing she owned. The hospital cooks gave Anna a handwritten cookbook with recipes for all the meals she loved. An old woman named Mrs. Henderson came to say goodbye. Her grandson had been a patient in Anna's ward. She hugged Anna tightly and said, "You took care of my boy. You will always be welcome in Canada." The last days in camp were strange and melancholy. The prisoners packed their belongings carefully. Each woman could take 20 kilograms, about 44 pounds. They chose carefully: books, letters, photos, medical supplies, clothes. The women who still believed in Nazi ideas said they could not wait to leave this place. Frau Kessler told Margaret bitterly, "Do not be fooled. They were only soft because they won the war. If we had won, we would have been much harder on them. Remember that." Margaret had heard enough. She said firmly, "We lost because we were cruel. They won because they were better than us in every way. Accept it or stay ignorant forever." On October 15th, the train left Medicine Hat. It traveled east across Canada on the same tracks they had crossed 17 months before. But everything felt different now. Elise watched the forests and lakes go by with different eyes. She said sadly, "I am leaving the first place that ever treated me like a human being instead of a tool." Anna looked at the farms and cities and asked, "Will Germany ever look like this again? No damage, no war, just peace." Margaret did not talk much. She wrote in her diary and looked out the window, preparing herself mentally for what waited across the ocean. The ship left Halifax on October 20th. It was called the SS Marine Raven, not a hospital ship like before. It was a cargo ship converted to carry people. The conditions were harder. The food was basic, but sufficient. There were 380 German prisoners going home from different Canadian camps across the country. The crossing took 12 days through rough Atlantic waters. During the voyage, news came over the radio about Nuremberg. The judges gave their sentences. Some Nazi leaders would hang. Others would go to prison for life. Germany was being divided permanently between East and West. The prisoners who still loved the Nazi Party were happy to go home anyway. The ones who had changed, like Margaret and Elise and Anna, felt sick with worry. Margaret said to Elise, "We are bringing truth back to a place that does not want truth anymore." On October 28, 1946, the ship arrived at Bremerhaven in Germany. Margaret saw her homeland for the first time in 18 months. What she saw made her want to cry. The port was destroyed. Some of it was rebuilt poorly, but most was still broken and abandoned. Mountains of rubble everywhere. People who looked like walking skeletons. British soldiers with guns controlling everything with harsh efficiency. The prisoners went through a processing center where men in uniforms asked them questions about their time as prisoners. Some women lied deliberately. They said the Canadians were mean and cruel because that was what the questioners wanted to hear. Margaret told the truth. She said the Canadians treated them well and taught them important things about humanity. The man writing her answers put a mark on her paper. It said, "Potentially subversive." That meant the government thought she might cause trouble with her truth. The guards searched all their bags thoroughly. They confiscated the medical supplies Catherine had given them. They said prisoners could not bring foreign materials into Germany. They gave each woman a travel permit to go to their home region. Anna's paper said Berlin now controlled by the Soviet Army. Elise's said Bavaria controlled by the American Army. Margaret's said Hamburg controlled by the British Army. Margaret arrived in Hamburg on November 2nd. Her old neighborhood was half destroyed. Her mother was living in the basement of a bombed building. When Margaret walked in, her mother stared at her like a ghost. Then she said coldly, "Where were you while we starved? You were living with the enemy eating their food." Margaret tried to explain how the Canadians treated her. Her mother did not believe a word. She said Margaret was a collaborator and a traitor. Margaret's brother had died fighting in Russia. Her mother blamed Margaret for being alive while her son was dead. Elise went to her family farm in Bavaria on November 5th. The farm survived mostly intact. Her parents were alive. Her mother cried and hugged her desperately. Her father did not talk about the war or the Nazi Party at all. He refused to discuss any of it. Elise kept most of her prisoner story secret from them. She wrote a letter to Catherine Ross and sent it through the American Army mail system secretly. Anna reached Berlin on November 10th. Her entire neighborhood was gone, just rubble and destroyed buildings. She could not find her mother or any trace of her home. The Soviet soldiers watched everyone carefully with suspicion. Anna found distant relatives in the western part of the city. They looked at her with distrust. A prisoner in Canada might be a spy for the Americans now. Anna got a job at a damaged hospital in the ruins. She never told anyone about Canada. She kept the cookbook hidden as her only treasure from that time. The three women learned the hardest lesson of all. They went from German propaganda to Canadian reality to German ruins. They went from expecting death to receiving kindness to facing actual starvation. They learned the truth, but their country did not want to hear it. The truth made them dangerous. The truth made them outsiders in their own homeland. And carrying that truth back to Germany was harder than any battle they could have imagined. The years after the war were hard for all three women, but they each found their own path forward through the ruins. Margaret stayed in Hamburg and worked at a hospital for refugees and displaced people. She used everything she learned in Medicine Hat, treating sick people the Canadian way, with dignity, respect, and the best medicine available despite shortages. She never spoke publicly about her time in Canada because people did not want to hear it. Germany was divided, occupied, starving. Nobody wanted to hear about prisoners who ate well while their families died. In 1948, she received a letter from Catherine Ross. Catherine offered to sponsor her to immigrate to Canada permanently. Margaret thought about it for months, torn between duty and survival. Should she abandon her homeland or escape the hopelessness? In 1949, she applied. In 1950, at age 39, she moved to Saskatchewan. She worked at Regina General Hospital and became friends with Catherine again. They stayed friends until Catherine died in 1979. Margaret never married. She gave her whole life to nursing. She trained hundreds of young nurses, teaching them not just medical techniques, but humanity, compassion, dignity. She died in 2002 at age 91, respected and remembered. Elise stayed in Bavaria and worked at a small hospital in the countryside. She quietly used the Canadian nursing methods she learned, but she did not tell people where she learned them. In 1951, she finally went to a real nursing school using the letter Dr. Murphy wrote for her. The American occupation authorities accepted it as valid credentials. By 1960, she was head nurse at a teaching hospital in Munich. She married an American soldier in 1952 and had 3 children. She kept writing letters to the Canadian family who had been kind to her during the war. In 1975, when she was 52 years old, she went back to Medicine Hat with her family for a 30-year anniversary visit. She saw Catherine and Dr. Murphy again. They were old now, gray and slower, but they remembered her clearly. They embraced like family. Elise cried when she saw the memorial sign at the hospital. It said, "In honor of German nurses who served here 1945 to 1946, proving humanity transcends conflict." She stayed in touch until she died in 2015 at age 92. Anna had the hardest time. Berlin was divided and dangerous. She worked in hospitals in the Soviet-controlled eastern sector under terrible conditions. But she used the medical knowledge from Canada without ever saying where she learned it. In 1950, during the Berlin blockade, she escaped to West Berlin. She got a job at an American field hospital. The American doctors noticed she had unusual nursing skills, techniques they recognized as North American. They asked where she learned them. She finally told the truth. In 1953, she married a German-American soldier and moved to Minnesota. From 1955 to 1985, she worked as a nurse in Minneapolis. She taught other nurses the Canadian methods, but just said she learned them during wartime experience. In 1987, she went back to Germany for the first time in 37 years. Only then did she tell her daughter the true story about being a prisoner in Canada. She said, "They saved my life by showing me the truth. That was more valuable than the food they gave me." Anna died in 2008 at age 82. In 1976, the Canadian government invited former German prisoners to come back for a reunion. 47 people who had been at Medicine Hat came back for the visit. 8 of the original 27 nurses were there, including Margaret and Elise. Anna could not come because she was sick. The town of Medicine Hat held a ceremony. The mayor declared it POW Reconciliation Day. Catherine Ross, retired, now gave a speech. She said, "These women taught us that enemies are just people on the other side of lies, and people can change when they are given truth and kindness instead of cruelty and propaganda." The local newspaper interviewed some of the former prisoners. Several Canadians had married former prisoners and built lives together. Many had moved to Canada permanently. The hospital put up a permanent memorial sign. In the 1980s, a historian from the University of Alberta interviewed the surviving prisoners for an oral history project. Margaret gave him her diary, her letters, and all her records. Elise gave him hospital documents from Medicine Hat. Anna finally agreed to share her story publicly. The recordings were saved at the Canadian War Museum in Ottawa. Margaret said in her interview, "Canada defeated our ideology without firing a shot at us. They fed us, healed us, and showed us a different way. That victory was more complete than any battlefield win." In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war ending, there was one final reunion in Medicine Hat. Only 12 former prisoners could come. They were between 70 and 80 years old now. But all 3 women, Margaret, Elise, and Anna, were still alive and able to travel. They stood together in the hospital, where they had worked 50 years before. The hospital was modern now, completely renovated, but the memorial sign was still there. Local students came to interview them for a history project. One student asked Margaret, "Did you forgive the Canadians for winning the war?" Margaret smiled. She was 84 years old. She said, "No, I thank them. There is a difference. They showed me I was wrong. That is the greatest gift anyone can give." The 3 women stood in front of the memorial sign together. The sign said, "You're still nurses." They were old now, bodies bent and tired, but their minds were sharp with memory. Before they died, they told their stories to anyone who would listen. Margaret said, "We came here expecting monsters and found humans. We were told strength means cruelty, but we learned strength means compassion. 50 years later, I understand. Canada did not defeat us with weapons. They defeated our lies with truth. That is the victory that lasts forever. Elise said, "I was 22 when I was captured. I thought my life was over. Instead, it began. Here I learned that nursing is not about nation or ideology. It is about healing anyone who suffers. That lesson shaped everything I became." Anna said, "In Berlin, I was told Canada was the enemy. In Medicine Hat, they showed me what the real enemy was. Propaganda, lies, the ideology that destroyed my country. And they taught me the cure evidence, kindness, truth. Simple things, but they saved my life and my soul. The lesson is clear and powerful. Humanity, when given a chance, chooses compassion over revenge. Truth, when shown clearly, defeats propaganda eventually. And people, when treated with dignity, often become their best selves instead of their worst. The question for all of us today is this: in our world of division and propaganda and hatred, which approach will we choose? The kindness that transforms enemies into colleagues, or the cruelty that creates enemies from neighbors? 27 German nurses came to Medicine Hat between 1945 and 1946. 23 lived to old age. 14 eventually moved to Canada or North America permanently. 8 kept contact with Canadian friends for their entire lives. None ever reported being mistreated in the POW camps. And every single one who stayed open to truth was transformed by it. They went home to Germany carrying a dangerous gift, the knowledge that everything they had been taught was lies. Some were rejected by their families for this truth. Some were called traitors. Some never spoke about it publicly. But they knew, and they passed that knowledge to their children and grandchildren. They became living proof that propaganda can be defeated, that hatred can be overcome, that transformation is possible even after believing terrible lies. The story of these 27 women is not about war. It is about the power of simple human decency to break through years of indoctrination. It is about the courage it takes to admit you were wrong about everything. It is about the choice between clinging to comfortable lies or accepting uncomfortable truth. Margaret, Elise, and Anna chose truth. And that choice defined the rest of their lives. They died knowing they had been wrong, but also knowing they had the courage to change. That is a rare and precious thing. In a world that constantly tells us to double down on our beliefs, to never admit error, to defend our side, no matter what, these 3 women showed a different path. They showed that admitting you were wrong is not weakness. It is the greatest strength. And sometimes the enemy teaches you more than your own side ever did. The memorial sign still stands at Medicine Hat Hospital today. New nurses walk past it every day, most not knowing the full story. But the words remain: "You're still nurses." 3 words that saved 27 lives. 3 words that defeated an ideology more completely than any bomb. 3 words that proved humanity always wins in the end if we let it. From 3 women who expected death and received life, who believed lies and discovered truth, who were enemies and became colleagues, comes this final lesson: the most powerful weapon is not the one that destroys, it is the one that transforms. And Canada wielded that weapon with devastating effectiveness against Nazi propaganda. They won not by matching cruelty with cruelty, but by meeting hatred with kindness. They won not by proving they were as brutal as the enemy claimed, but by proving the enemy's claims were completely false. That is how you win forever.